They say a man's scars tell his story, but sometimes the deepest wounds are hidden, buried not in flesh, but beneath the surface of a life carefully constructed to hide the impossible. In the summer of 1973, in a small town tucked deep in the Rust Belt of America, a man named Henry Calloway was admitted to a rural emergency room after collapsing on his kitchen floor. What doctors found inside his body would defy reason, and what investigators uncovered afterward would unravel one of the most disturbing personal histories in modern American memory. It began as a routine X-ray. The black and white image flickered to life under the harsh fluorescent light, and there it was. Embedded in the soft tissue near his ribcage was a metal object, perfectly shaped, unmistakably sharp. A knife blade. Not a fragment, not a sliver, but a blade whole enough to still cast a shadow on the screen. No entry wound, no scar, no logical explanation. When the doctor asked how long it had been there, Henry stared blankly, as though the question itself was meaningless. He said he'd never been stabbed, never been in a fight. He'd never even been to the hospital before. But when the surgeon recommended immediate removal, Henry refused. He said, in a low, trembling voice, "It's not mine to take out." That sentence, 5 words spoken through cracked lips, would mark the beginning of one of the strangest and most unsettling investigations in local history. Because as police, doctors, and journalists began peeling back the story of Henry Calloway's life, they discovered that the knife wasn't just inside him by chance. It was a family secret, a relic of something ancient and violent, carried forward from one generation to the next. In that small, forgotten town, whispers began spreading about what happened in the Calloway house, about what Henry's father did before disappearing in the winter of 1958, and about why Henry's body bore no scars, but his soul seemed to carry all of them. By the time authorities pieced together the truth, it was already too late. Henry's body had become the vessel of something much older than pain. The truth, they would learn, was buried under layers of silence, blood, and ritual, and the knife inside him. It was only the beginning. The Calloway family lived on the outskirts of town, where the forest pressed close against the rusting fences, and the air always smelled faintly of iron and rain. Their farmhouse stood like a monument to something long dead, paint peeling, windows clouded, roof sagging beneath decades of neglect. Yet the townspeople said the Calloways never moved, never sold, never left, as if they were bound to that patch of land by something stronger than choice. Henry was the last of them, the last branch of a line that had once been prosperous, respected, even feared. His grandfather, Thomas Calloway, was a blacksmith who forged tools and weapons for half the county. His hands built fortunes, but his temper destroyed them. There were stories, unverified, but persistent, that he believed pain was a form of inheritance, that every sin of a man must be repaid in flesh, and that every wrong cut must leave a mark somewhere. When Henry was a boy, the neighbors recalled seeing him wandering barefoot in the woods, muttering to himself, hands smeared with soot. They said his father, Samuel, kept him out there for hours at a time. To learn the old ways, he'd say. No one knew what that meant, but they all remembered the sound that would follow, the rhythmic clang of metal on metal echoing through the trees. And then, one winter, the sound stopped. The year was 1958. Samuel Calloway disappeared. No note, no trace. Just a furnace left burning low and the faint, acrid smell of blood in the forge. The sheriff's report claimed there was no evidence of foul play, but those who lived nearby swore they saw something that night. A faint orange glow in the woods, as if the fire hadn't gone out at all. Henry was 12 then, and from that day forward, he never spoke his father's name again. For years he lived alone on the family property, working odd jobs fixing engines, and keeping mostly to himself. But those who met him remembered the same thing, the way he winced when standing too long, how his hand would twitch near his ribs, and the faint metallic clink they sometimes heard when he moved too quickly. It wasn't until decades later, when his body betrayed him in that kitchen, that the truth began to surface. The knife wasn't just inside him. It had been placed there, with purpose, with ritual, and with blood that wasn't entirely his own. The Calloway curse, they whispered, had never ended. It had simply gone quiet, until now. The doctors tried to reason with him. They said the blade could shift at any moment, cut through an artery, kill him without warning. But Henry didn't care. He told them softly, almost apologetically, that he'd lived with it long enough to know it wouldn't hurt him. Not yet. When they pressed further, asking where it came from, his voice changed. Cold, deliberate. "It was given to me," he said. "Same way it was given to my father." That sentence chilled everyone in the room, because the way he said it, there was no sense of metaphor or madness. Just certainty, the kind that comes from a truth too heavy to invent. They contacted the sheriff's office, which reopened the old 1958 missing person case of Samuel Calloway. But when they tried to find Henry again for questioning, he'd vanished. He left the hospital that night, walking out barefoot into the fog. The only trace he left behind was his hospital gown, folded neatly on the bed, and a smear of black soot on the window ledge. When investigators searched the Calloway farmhouse, they found something no one expected: a workshop beneath the basement, sealed by a rusted iron door. Inside were rows of handmade knives, all identical to the one seen in Henry's X-ray. Each blade was wrapped in cloth marked with initials, SC, TC, and dozens more, stretching back generations. The final one, unfinished, was marked simply with an H beside the forge. They found a journal. Its pages were brittle with age, written in a hand that changed styles over decades, as though passed from father to son. The entries were brief, cold, methodical. They spoke of binding the spirit, forging the flesh, and keeping the mark alive. The most recent entry, dated only a year before Henry's collapse, read, "It's waking again. The steel remembers." That phrase would haunt the lead investigator, Sheriff Dalton, for the rest of his life. Because 2 weeks after reading it, he received a package at his office. No return address. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was an X-ray. Henry's X-ray. But now the blade had moved. It had shifted closer to the heart, and beneath the film, written in that same looping script, was a single line. "When it cuts, the bloodline ends." Sheriff Dalton, didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office long after the town had gone quiet, the streetlights flickering through the blinds like the pulse of something dying. He kept staring at the X-ray, running his finger over the faint outline of the knife blade, as if trying to feel the truth through the paper. Henry Calloway had disappeared without a trace, but somehow his story was still bleeding into the present, one careful drop at a time. Dalton knew the history of the Calloways better than most. His father had worked the same case in 1958 when Samuel vanished, and before that, his grandfather had investigated Thomas Calloway after rumors of ritual harm at the forge. Each generation of lawmen chasing the same shadow, but none of them ever found enough evidence to make it real. It was always whispers, always folklore, always that same smell of soot and rust clinging to the edge of memory. The next morning, Dalton drove to the Calloway property. The grass had grown waist-high, and the windows were black with mold. But inside the basement forge, the air felt warm. Too warm, like something had been burning only moments ago. On the workbench, laid out with surgical precision, was a single sheet of metal, still glowing faintly red. He found a hammer beside it, and beneath the hammer, etched into the anvil, were words carved deep into the steel. "It must stay in the blood." Dalton turned to leave, but the sound stopped him cold. A faint metallic clink behind him, echoing in the silence, like steel brushing against bone. He spun around, gun drawn, but there was no one there. Only the forge, still pulsing with heat. Back at the station, he pulled the property records. The Calloway land had changed hands multiple times, on paper at least. But every sale led back to the same signature, rewritten in different ink, under different names: Henry Calloway. The man had been dead on paper since 1973, but legally, he'd never left that house. Dalton began to wonder if Henry had ever truly left anything. That night, he dreamed of fire, of a man hammering steel in the dark, and each time the hammer fell, he saw flashes of faces. Men who looked the same through the years, as if the Calloway blood refused to die, simply shifting from one vessel to the next. When he woke, his hands were black with soot, and the X-ray was gone. The following days brought whispers through the town again, quiet at first, but growing like infection. People said they'd seen Henry walking along the train tracks at night, his chest bare, something metallic glinting under his skin when the headlights passed. Others swore they'd heard the hammering again, faint but steady, coming from beneath the ground. The forge was alive. Sheriff Dalton told no one about the soot on his hands. He told no one about the missing X-ray. But deep down, he knew what was happening. The Calloway curse wasn't a story, it was a system. A ritual built to survive through blood. And he, through his own obsession, had already stepped into it. He returned to the property one last time. The air felt heavier there, like breathing through ashes. Inside the house, he found new footprints in the dust. Bare, adult-sized, leading from the cellar door to the forge. The fire was cold, but the tools were warm to the touch, as if they'd just been held. Dalton found another journal, smaller, newer. Inside were sketches of human anatomy, diagrams showing where metal could be inserted without killing the host. Each drawing labeled in a trembling hand. Inheritance points. There were names, too. Men from the town, some long dead, others still living. At the bottom of the page, one name had been added recently, his own. That night, Dalton went home and sat in silence. He kept hearing the faint rhythm of hammering in his ears, even when the world outside was still. He began to understand the knife was never meant to kill. It was meant to contain, to hold something inside, something that must never escape. The next morning, Dalton resigned from the force. He left town quietly, without farewell. But those who cleaned his office after he left found something unsettling in his desk drawer, an X-ray envelope, empty except for a small, folded piece of paper. On it, written in a hand that wasn't his, were 5 words. "It's yours now. Keep it. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most." Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Because what comes next isn't just Henry's story. It's what happens when something forged in darkness refuses to die. Years passed. The story of Henry Calloway faded into local legend, something the old men at the bar would mutter about when the power went out and the rain pressed against the windows. The Calloway property was finally condemned, its structure collapsing under rotten memory. But the land remained untouched. No one dared to build there. The county even rerouted the road so no one had to drive past it at night. But in 1987, the curse resurfaced. A young construction worker named David Rourke was helping clear the forest for a new housing project when his backhoe struck metal underground. At first, he thought it was just old tools or scrap left behind by farmers. But when he climbed down into the shallow pit, what he found was not machinery. It was a box, iron, welded shut, blackened by age. He pried it open with a crowbar. Inside lay a human rib cage, perfectly clean, polished, and fused around a knife blade. The bones had grown over it, gripping the steel like fingers frozen in fear. The medical examiner who received the remains couldn't explain it. There were no signs of decomposition, no signs of burial. It was as if the bones themselves had been forged rather than grown. And when they tested the metal, it matched the same alloy found in the Calloway forge. When word spread, the town remembered. People started digging through old records again, and the Calloway name crept back into the newspapers, once more paired with words like unholy, ritual, and curse. But what most people didn't know was that the land the crew had been clearing wasn't the Calloway property at all. It was 2 miles east, on land that used to belong to Sheriff Dalton, the same man who vanished after his resignation, the same man who'd once said the knife must stay in the blood. Inside his abandoned cabin, searchers found a furnace of his own, crude, smaller than the one under the Calloway home, but active. The logs beside it were soaked with black residue, and nailed to the wall, half hidden behind soot, was a map, a family tree. The Calloway line branching, merging, crossing through other families in town, unnoticed, unrecorded. The curse, it seemed, hadn't died. It had simply adapted, and now it was everywhere. The deeper the investigators dug, the more the town began to unravel. Birth records were missing, cemetery plots had been disturbed, and people who once laughed at the legend started to whisper again when the sun went down. They said that at night you could hear the ring of metal under the earth, steady and rhythmic, like a blacksmith working a forge no one could find. The coroner's office confirmed something strange. Every family that had intermarried with the Calloway line showed identical bone anomalies in medical scans, small calcified fragments near the ribcage, sometimes mistaken for shrapnel or surgical metal. But none of those people had ever undergone operations, and none of them could remember ever being injured there. Doctors tried to explain it away as coincidence, an inherited mutation, but the fragments were too uniform, too deliberate, like someone had placed them there generations ago, and the body had simply grown around them. Then came the children. In the fall of 1988, 2 local boys disappeared while playing near the forest edge. They were found 3 days later, unharmed but shaken. When asked what happened, they said a man, made of fire and noise, had told them to go home, that he was fixing something in the ground. When shown old photographs, both pointed at Henry Calloway without hesitation. By now the town was coming apart under its own fear. Some left, others burned their homes, claiming they could hear something moving inside the walls. But a few stayed, determined to uncover the truth. Among them was a reporter named Martha Keene, a woman who'd spent her life digging up forgotten crimes. She arrived in town with a tape recorder and a promise to tell the story no one else would dare. Her first recording began with a whisper. If this tape is found, it means the forge is still burning. And if it's burning, then the Calloway name isn't finished with us. The last sound on that tape wasn't her voice. It was the clang of steel. One, then two, then silence. And when police searched her motel room 2 days later, the bed was empty, the sheets folded neatly. On the pillow lay a single X-ray, not of Henry, of Martha, and inside her chest, embedded near the ribs, was the unmistakable outline of a blade. The discovery of Martha Keene's X-ray marked the moment the story crossed from rumor to something much darker, something real. Her disappearance couldn't be dismissed as hysteria, not when her belongings, recordings, and the physical film were right there in evidence. The X-ray was authenticated by 3 separate technicians. Each confirmed the same unsettling detail. The knife inside her chest wasn't identical to Henry's. It was newer, smaller, thinner, more precise. As if whoever, or whatever, had placed it there was refining the process. The town fell silent after that. Local papers stopped printing the story, law enforcement sealed the Calloway files, and the hospital destroyed the X-rays without explanation. But secrets that deep never stay buried, they ferment. In 1992, a janitor at the county morgue broke his silence. He told a state investigator that he'd seen the Calloway remains, Henry's, Samuel's, even Thomas's, hauled in under different case numbers across 30 years. They looked the same, he said, trembling. Same face, same hands, just older, like the body kept starting over. The investigator dismissed it as delusion. But when they checked the records, they found the photographs the janitor mentioned, each one showing a man of nearly identical bone structure, identical scar patterns. Each one bearing, faintly visible on the X-ray film, a blade. By now, the government had taken over what was left of the case. They classified it under something vague and bureaucratic. Multi-generational pathology study. The Calloway property was razed, the soil sealed under concrete, and the forge filled with salt. But even after that, locals claimed the ground hummed at night, low and steady, as if something alive was still working beneath the slab. The story might have ended there, fading into local legend again, if not for one final discovery. In 2004, an archivist named Robert Miller, cataloging abandoned evidence, opened a crate marked, "Disposal Approved." Inside were the remnants of Martha Keene's belongings, her tape recorder, her notes, and a small bundle wrapped in hospital gauze. When he unwrapped it, he found something cold and metallic, a knife blade.
But this one wasn't like the others.
It was engraved, 2 words etched deep into the steel, forged remembering. That night, Miller brought the blade home. He wanted to photograph it for his own records. The next morning, his wife found him on the kitchen floor. Dead, no wound, just a faint black mark across his ribs, shaped like the edge of a knife. After Robert Miller's death, the county sealed the archives for good. Officially, it was labeled as a containment closure. But those who'd worked there whispered a different story. They said the lights flickered constantly in that room, even after the power was cut. They said that, if you stood there long enough, you could hear it. The slow, steady clang of metal from somewhere far below, echoing through the concrete floor. The police report on Miller's death was short and cold. Cardiac failure, no trauma observed. But the autopsy photos, those that leaked, told another story. His ribs showed microfractures, hairline splits that followed the curve of something sharp. The coroner, who'd worked for 20 years without incident, resigned the next day. Before he left town, he told a colleague something that would never appear in any file. He said, the bone wasn't broken from the outside. It was pushed from within. By now, the Calloway name had become a warning, spoken in the same breath as other local curses, dismissed by outsiders as myth. But to the few who'd seen the evidence firsthand, it was clear the story wasn't over. Every few years, someone new would go missing. Someone connected by blood or by curiosity. A man digging a well on the edge of town found an iron shard buried 12 feet down. When he lifted it out, he noticed something strange. The shard was warm, too warm, and stamped faintly into the metal, beneath layers of rust, was that same phrase, forged remembering. And then the dreams began. People started reporting visions, smoke furnaces, the sound of hammers, the smell of hot steel. Some saw a man working the forge, his face hidden, his hands raw and bleeding. Each said he looked up at them through the smoke and whispered the same thing. The blood forgets, but the steel remembers. Local historians later discovered something eerie. The forge that once stood on the Calloway property wasn't unique. Its design, the shape of the anvil, the dimensions of the furnace, matched blacksmith shops from the 1700s, brought over by settlers from a small village in Europe. That village had its own legend, a family who claimed they could trap souls in metal. A bloodline said to have vanished centuries ago. Except it didn't vanish. It migrated. And the Calloway name first appeared in America the same year that village burned to the ground. By the late 2010s, the story had become more than a legend. It had become a pattern. Investigators who had tried to map out the Calloway lineage noticed something terrifying. The blade didn't just appear in one body. It passed from father to son, uncle to nephew, sometimes skipping a generation, but always returning. Sometimes it appeared in those who weren't even aware they were part of the bloodline. DNA tests revealed gaps, anomalies, markers that didn't match standard inheritance patterns. The knife seemed to follow something deeper than blood. It followed essence, lineage, the very marrow of the family. Even modern medicine couldn't explain it. Surgeons who had examined similar cases described a phenomenon that seemed impossible, the body reacting to the presence of a foreign object as though it belonged there, growing tissue around it, protecting it. And yet the metal remained cold, unyielding, alive in a way science couldn't measure. Every X-ray, every CT scan confirmed the same impossible truth. The steel was integrated, fused with the body, and somehow aware. A former FBI profiler assigned to the case, who spoke anonymously years later, said the psychological patterns were as disturbing as the physical ones. Every member of the Calloway line displayed compulsive behaviors around metal, heat, and fire. They built things, they hammered things, they feared abandonment. Many had vivid, recurring nightmares of a man wielding a hammer in the dark, forging something that wasn't entirely metal nor entirely human. And then there were the disappearances. Every generation had a few, those who vanished without trace, sometimes for weeks, sometimes forever, often returned changed, hollow-eyed, speaking in hushed tones about fixing the blood, about completing the forge. Others never returned, and yet their bodies would eventually resurface decades later, perfectly preserved, still clutching a knife, etched with the same mark. Forged remembering. The profiler's final note on the case was chilling. This is not a curse in the traditional sense. This is a contract, something agreed upon generations ago. And like any contract, it cannot be broken, it can only be fulfilled. And somewhere, deep in the forgotten corners of America, the forge still waits. The final piece of the puzzle came unexpectedly. In 2021, a historian researching unsolved disappearances in rural America stumbled upon a series of letters buried in a private collection. The letters were from Henry Calloway's grandfather, Thomas, addressed to a man in Europe whose name was blacked out. In them, Thomas described a method to preserve the line and bind the spirit in steel, using words that were almost surgical in their precision. He wrote about choosing the right vessels, children born into the family healthy and strong, whose bodies could carry the memory. He spoke of knives forged from specific metals, cooled in water drawn from particular springs, and of the careful rituals required to insert them without leaving scars. The letters ended abruptly with a single sentence. The blade remembers, and when the blood fails, it will find another. Researchers realized the horrifying truth. The blade wasn't merely symbolic, it was functional. It acted as a vessel, a repository of memory and essence. When someone in the bloodline died, disappeared, or failed in some way, the blade carried the accumulated force of the lineage. And if a new vessel emerged, a descendant, a relative, anyone genetically tied, it would inevitably find its way inside. The historian tried to warn the authorities, but the letters themselves disappeared before any investigation could begin. Only copies remained, heavily redacted, enough to show that the lineage had persisted for centuries, crossing oceans, wars, and generations, and that the American branch, the Calloways, were merely the latest chapter. Even more disturbing were the townspeople's accounts, verified by independent researchers. Locals still reported faint hammering in the night. The smell of hot metal and blood sometimes drifted through the abandoned Calloway land. And occasionally, someone would catch sight of a figure, a man, indistinct in the darkness, moving methodically, working at a forge that shouldn't exist. No one could explain it, and no one dared approach. Because whatever haunted that place wasn't merely a man. It was a legacy, a history forged in fire, bound in steel, and preserved in human flesh. The question remains, how long can such a lineage survive? And how many lives are waiting to carry the knife next? Somewhere, beyond the edges of maps and the limits of law, the forge still exists. Hidden beneath layers of earth, concrete, and secrecy, it waits for the next Calloway, or anyone linked by blood, to step close enough for it to awaken. The hammering never truly stops. The heat never fully cools. And the steel, cold to the touch yet alive in its own way, continues to remember. Those who have glimpsed it, lived near it, or touched its remnants describe a weight in their chest, a pulling towards something they cannot name. A quiet pressure, as if the knife inside them, whether present or not, is aware of the observer, and those who try to escape often find themselves drawn back, compelled by a force older than conscience, older than morality. Henry Calloway's story was never just about one man. It was about an inheritance no one asked for, a pact made centuries ago, and a family whose bloodline became the vessel of memory, of violence, and of preservation. Each knife taste, each life touched, carries a whisper of the past, a reminder that some secrets are too dark, too precise, to ever be fully hidden. Perhaps that is the final lesson of the Calloways that history does not forget. That blood, metal, and memory are bound together in ways the living cannot understand. And that sometimes the darkest truths are not found in newspapers or court records, but in the very bodies of those who bear them. So if you ever find yourself standing before an old, abandoned forge, or hear the faint ring of metal in the distance, remember it is not always fire you smell. It is steel remembering what it has carried for centuries, and some things once forged can never be undone, because the knife waits, it always waits.